Jarrett Bilous is with us, Managing Director, Transportation, Aerospace and Defense, S&P Global Ratings. Thank you for being here. Let's start with Boeing, because obviously Boeing is the key to all of these airlines. If Boeing has problems, many of these airlines have problems. The very latest is that a Boeing plane loses the nose wheel of a 757 jet. It fell off and rolled away in Atlanta as the jet was ready to take off. Boeing's headlines, that's terrible. Your thoughts on what's going on for Boeing? Is it a buy here? Maybe because it's sold off 20%? Or are you worried?
Well, I can't suggest a buy recommendation as I focus on credit ratings. But obviously the headlines aren't great. I think we're still waiting to hear a little more from the company when they report next week to get a little better insight on some of the issues that they've been facing and hitting a lot of headlines, causing some consternation on some of their airline customers, obviously with some of the part groundings and delays that are forthcoming or that have happened and are forthcoming.
Do you think it's better or worse? I mean, that was my first question when I heard that, in fact, the Boeing mechanics failed to properly install the bolts, that it was not Spirit that misinstalled the piece for that Alaska Max jet. Is that better or worse for Boeing? Because maybe it was just a one-off problem and everybody checks and it's fine, or is that a worse problem?
I'd rather not speculate. I think it's something that the company has to address. And again, hate to repeat myself, but don't want to speak for the company. I think it's better left in their hands to say whether or not how they're planning to address this issue.
That's fine. That's fine. I was just thinking in my own mind, like if you had the company or you were a shareholder or you own the company, would you rather have somebody sort of mess up the installation or have the bigger problem of trying to figure out where the problems were? That being said, can we talk about some of the names that have reported, Delta and UAL? What are your thoughts on those two names?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, the results for 2023 were pretty solid for both companies, generally in line with what we were expecting for this year. I think going forward, it's again, generally in line with what we had assumed, perhaps a little more subdued. But I think some of the key takeaways for us is that domestic demand appears to be pretty solid. That was an area of, excuse me, that was an area of concern from a lot of the investors that we talked to over the past 6 months or so. It appears that there's somewhat of an inflection on pricing. Domestic demand is the majority share of revenues for these airlines, so I think that's a positive. The other thing that is interesting is that capacity is going to be subdued this year. That's obviously related to some of the delivery delays that we're expected to continue to see, as well as some of the just plans of the airlines to optimize some of their capacity following a pretty significant period of growth over the past year. But I think the final takeaway, key takeaway, is that costs, it's not a big surprise, costs are going to be higher, and that's going to make it harder for the airlines to grow their earnings this year. So we can't rule out upside. I think both United and Delta expects that they could potentially reach the higher end of their public guidance. So it's a wait and see on those fronts. But overall, I would say pretty much stable outlook for the airlines through this year.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk about the debt levels, which have declined since the start of the pandemic, as you noted. I will just say Delta's outlook seemed a little weaker than United's outlook. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that, but also talk about the debt levels about this group.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the outlook was decidedly different between the two. I think both are pretty measured. A lot of it is related to some uncertainty on the earnings guide as well as CapEx. In terms of how much shifts to the right, given some of the delivery delays. And I think United was pretty clear that it's possible that they could lower their guidance of roughly $9 billion for this year, potentially lower, and more to come on that. So I think, with that, it could be potentially a near-term benefit if that lower CapEx leads to some more free cash flow that potentially affords ability to repay more debt or further bolster their cash positions. But as you mentioned, debt levels are still above where they were prior to the start of the pandemic. There's certainly been some improvement, and we've reflected that in our credit ratings over the past year with several upgrades. So the expectation is that the airlines will continue to remain focused on balance sheet strength and potential improvements from here. So I think overall they're moving in the right direction on the balance sheet side of the ledger.
I mean, it sounds like across the board that you're more positive than negative, other than maybe the consumer being a little bit more subdued, but you do have the business consumer coming back a little bit. Maybe that'll balance things out. Final thoughts, just also, we are going to hear from American and Southwest. I didn't know if you have any specific thoughts on those companies. And what happened to that merger? I mean, the Spirit JetBlue, is it as dead can be, or do you think it could be sort of rekindled in some way?
Well, I guess I'll take your last question first. On the Spirit JetBlue, it's unknown. There is an appeal. Based on some of the disclosure that we've read in terms of the DOJ blocking the deal, it looks like it could be a challenge for them to actually contemplate completing that deal. We recently lowered our rating on Spirit based on the likelihood that this deal, if on appeal, it will take some time to resolve. And in the meantime, we're focused on the standalone profile of Spirit. So it's unknown, but it appears that mergers, based on some of the language that has been disclosed with that ruling, appears unlikely, but we'll see. And I think, in terms of what we're expecting from Southwest and American, I think it will be interesting to also see if they're seeing the same levels of strength in demand domestically going forward. It will be interesting as well to get a sense of the competitive position as it relates to some of those lower cost airlines, and whether or not the increase in cost is truly having a lasting effect on their ability to compete in these domestic regional markets.
All right, Jarrett Bilous, great to see you. Thank you for all of that. Nice look there at the airlines group of S&P Global Ratings.